From temples where women offered themselves to gods in exchange for cosmic balance, to Japanese festivals where giant steel phalluses are paraded through the streets like beloved celebrities, to blood-soaked wedding rites where the first kiss came after the first incision. If you enjoy stories that make you question both history and your search history, feel free to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find joy in the strange, the sacred, and the slightly uncomfortable. And tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you? Are you in bed, under a blanket of algorithms, at your desk pretending to work, or somewhere dark and quiet, where ancient gods might still be watching? Wherever you are, welcome. Let's begin. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. You, with your earbuds and your swipe left dating app, could have been someone who learned about love, not from movies, but from gods. If you had been born into a world stitched together by myth and weather and obligation, then love wouldn't have been a private thing. It would have been sacred, uncomfortable, probably sticky, and almost definitely supervised by a priest with strong opinions and very little personal space. Because once upon a time, long before scented candles and passive-aggressive text messages, falling in love meant entering a contract with the divine. Intimacy wasn't spontaneous. It was orchestrated, timed, rehearsed, blessed, and sometimes penalized with animal entrails. You didn't woo someone over dinner. You offered grain to a fertility idol and hoped it didn't crack in half, because that would mean your union was cursed and your crops would fail. Romantic. In Mesopotamia, the land where bureaucracy was born, and so was arguably the first midlife crisis, love was temple business. In Sumer, in Uruk, in those glittering cities that rose like mirages from the desert floor, the goddess Inanna didn't just sit quietly in a corner. She ruled sex, war, and the stars, multitasking with terrifying elegance. Her temples weren't silent sanctuaries. They were buzzing centers of sacred desire. And if you were chosen, or just unlucky enough to be born into that calling, you could have been a Kadishtu, a holy woman, a sacred prostitute. But don't let the modern scandal of that word distract you. This wasn't transactional, it was transcendental. Offering your body in the temple of Inanna wasn't shameful. It was divine service. It was civic duty. It was part of the cosmic maintenance program, like rotating your tires, but with more oil and hymns. Some say, Herodotus being the loudest and least trustworthy among them, that every Babylonian woman had to visit the temple once in her life and sleep with a stranger to honor the goddess. The details get fuzzy. The sources are biased. But the ritualized merging of love, sex, and religion, that part's real. And for a culture that measured time by moonlight and justice by flood levels, aligning your lust with the will of the gods made perfect sense. Because sex, in these rites, wasn't about pleasure. It was about power. Fertility wasn't just personal. It was national infrastructure. If the women weren't fertile, the fields weren't either. If the goddess was pleased, the granaries filled. If she was annoyed, well, plague, locusts, or worse, a year without beer. So your love life, dear alternate self, would have been far more public than you're used to. You'd have prayed before kissing, consulted an astrologer before touching. You might have had a designated date on the lunar calendar when you were expected to perform. And yes, elders might have judged your technique, out loud, but this wasn't perversion, not to them. This was devotion. Offerings weren't limited to grain and incense. Bodies were part of the economy of sacred balance. And the gods, as always, were watching, probably through the eyes of a stone idol with anatomically exaggerated features. And just when you start to think ancient love couldn't get any stranger, or any more choreographed, imagine trading your private temple rites for a public frenzy in the woods, where modesty and memory both go missing. You could have been there, draped in ivy, your breath sweet with fermented chaos, stumbling barefoot through the hills of Thrace or the back alleys of Athens. You could have shouted with the Maenads, torn figs from their branches like they were forbidden truths, and offered your voice, your whole trembling body, to the wild-eyed god of ecstasy and disorder, Dionysus, the one who made losing control feel like worship. Because in that world, love wasn't always calm. It didn't glow soft in candlelight. Sometimes it howled, sometimes it convulsed, sometimes it danced itself into delirium. If Aphrodite taught you how to seduce, Dionysus taught you how to disappear into rhythm, into strangers, into a frenzy so thick with wine and sweat that you forgot where the gods ended and you began. The Dionysian rituals weren't subtle. They weren't meant to be. They happened under the moon, in forests, or in shadowy corners of the city, depending on how nervous the authorities were feeling. Women, especially women, were possessed. That was the term. They left their homes and their roles behind, and they became something else, something divine and terrifying. And if you had been born into that world, you might have followed them, or feared them, or both. You might have worn a fawnskin, carried a thyrsus, a staff topped with a pinnacone, like a botanical scepter for the spiritually drunk. You might have believed that tearing a goat to pieces with your bare hands was a reasonable prelude to spiritual rebirth, or that drinking until your soul blurred at the edges brought you closer to eternity. This wasn't indulgence, it was initiation. It was a release valve in a society obsessed with order. Greek life was full of lines: citizen versus slave, male versus female, polis versus chaos. But Dionysus didn't care. He broke every border. The drunk, the foreigner, the feminine, the animal, all belonged to him. And when the Bacchae gathered, they did so to dissolve their shame, their structure, their individuality. Love here was violent, intimate, communal, and not optional. Even the Romans, structured and suspicious as they were, couldn't resist. They called it bacchanalia, and at first, they tried to regulate it, limit the numbers, restrict the locations. But it didn't take long for the ritual to seep out of the temples and into the streets, down into the underbelly of Rome, where senators feared their daughters would return from the festival with leaves in their hair and rebellion in their eyes. Eventually, it got banned. Officially, the Senate declared it subversive, which it was. It threatened the hierarchy. It reminded the empire that passion has teeth, and that love, when tied to ecstasy, tends to eat rules for breakfast. Still, it never really disappeared. You can't outlaw yearning, or rhythm, or the sacred intoxication that makes the world shimmer with meaning. And if you had lived then, you might have hidden your worship, pretended you were going to market, snuck off barefoot at dusk, whispered your prayers into a cup of wine, and joined the procession when no one was watching. Because under all the myth, there's a pattern where society builds walls, desire finds a crack, and if wine, music, and half-divine seduction weren't your thing, well, there were other ways to turn lust into divinity, some far more restrained, some terrifyingly intimate, some drawn not in wine, but in ink and breath and stillness. If you'd been born beneath the monsoon skies of ancient India, your relationship with love would have felt less like a spark and more like a sacred equation, not impulsive, not wild, but cosmic, deliberate, precise. Here, passion wasn't something to surrender to, it was something to master. The body wasn't shameful, it was an instrument, and if you played it correctly, you didn't just feel pleasure, you touched the divine. This wasn't hedonism, it was architecture. You didn't chase ecstasy, you constructed it. The Vedic texts, early and austere, hinted at it, but it was the tantras that truly opened the gates. They spoke of Shakti and Shiva, feminine and masculine forces, not just as gods, but as currents moving through everything, sky and stone, fire and thought. And through you, always through you. So if you'd been born into one of the esoteric sects that took these teachings seriously and secretly, your education in love might have begun not with affection, but with discipline, breathing techniques, meditation, postures, not for show, not for flexibility, but for energy. You'd learn that desire wasn't dirty, just misdirected, and that holding it, containing it, letting it simmer just below your skin, that was where the magic happened. And eventually, there'd be the ritual union, not orgy, not spectacle, but an act of worship between two initiates, performed in candlelight, yes, but also in exact sequences, aligned chakras, controlled breathing, recitations, the body as temple, the act as offering. The aim wasn't climax, it was moksha, liberation. You didn't seek to possess your partner, you dissolved into them, slowly, respectfully. You became the sky. They became the earth. And somewhere between your spine and your solar plexus, a serpent of energy, kundalini, uncoiled and began to rise. Or so they said. Of course, not everyone practiced this. Most people married, had children, lived full lives without ever chanting a mantra in bed. But in those secret circles, in temples now half-ruined and covered in vines, love was studied like a science, depicted in sculpture, in poetry, in positions that made later colonizers faint dramatically and order fig leaves. What you feel when you fall in love, they mapped it. What happens when your breath syncs with another's? They documented it. The Kama Sutra wasn't just a bedroom manual. It was a philosophical treatise, a lifestyle, a guide to everything from choosing perfumes to the timing of a kiss. Because nothing about the art of love was considered trivial. And it wasn't just about sex. It was about rasa, flavor, essence, the juice of life. You were meant to savor it, not rush it, not apologize for it, not hide it under fluorescent lighting and bad metaphors. But that calm, ritual intimacy, it wasn't the only way to intertwine passion and power. Some cultures didn't wait for sacred union. They bled for it, cut skin instead of fruit, and married love to sacrifice, not metaphor. Because if you'd been born into a city of sunstone and obsidian, your wedding might have involved a little more pain. You could have stood there, trembling slightly under feathers and sun, on a day that wasn't quite yours, and watched the obsidian blade glint in your priest's hand. Not with fear, not exactly, with reverence. Because in the heart of the Mexico world, what we now call the Aztec Empire, even love was a transaction of blood. Not metaphorical, not symbolic, actual blood, yours. Marriage wasn't just a legal or emotional arrangement. It was a cosmological tether. And the gods, in all their hungry brilliance, needed more than promises. They needed proof. So if you were the bride, your lip might be pierced. Just a little. If you were the groom, your ear or tongue, a few drops, no more. Enough to remind the sun why it rises. Enough to whisper to the maize gods that yes, you still understand your place in the great, trembling cycle of sacrifice and survival. Because in that empire of stone and sky, every human act was watched, scored, graded, even. Your wedding wasn't a day off from spiritual obligation. It was an opportunity to renew the lease on creation. And if that sounds dramatic, remember, to them, existence itself was a favor. The gods had bled to make the world. The least you could do was offer a little back on your big day. Now, not every wedding involved a knife. Some were quiet, arranged with corn, beer, incense, and ritual foot washing. But even the gentler ceremonies had a certain edge. You were entering not just a partnership, but a system, a reproductive engine for the state, a womb for warriors, a father of future offerings. You married not just a person, but a cosmology. And if your heart fluttered for your spouse, truly fluttered, that was sweet, but also beside the point. Love might come later, or not at all. What mattered was balance, role, reciprocity, and sacrifice. Always sacrifice. Some depictions of Aztec marriage rites even describe a binding ceremony where the couple's garments were literally tied together, sleeves knotted, hands held over sacred fire, two bodies tethered like planets. But marriage wasn't a closed circuit. It was public, observed, waited with the expectation that your union would please the gods and produce heirs who understood where they came from and what they might someday be asked to give. You could have been that child, born from blood, raised on myth, told that your parents didn't just love each other, they bled for each other. For you, and just maybe, you would have grown up thinking that pain was part of love, not in some twisted, tragic way, but in the sense that real love costs something. Always, of course. Not every culture stitched blood and love so tightly. In some places, they used joy instead, laughter, even candy. Because if you'd arrived not in the Valley of Mexico, but in a fishing village near Kawasaki, your rites of fertility might have involved less pain and significantly more penis-shaped pastries. If you'd been born in Japan, not the Japan of samurai epics and minimalist tea ceremonies, but the lively, neon-flashing, slightly absurd in all the right places, Japan, your initiation into sacred love might have involved less chanting and more sculpted candy. Because nestled in the industrial town of Kawasaki, there's a shrine that doesn't pretend love is subtle. Every spring, it erupts into celebration during Kanamara Matsuri, the festival of the steel phallus. And yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. Imagine yourself weaving through the crowd, holding a pink lollipop shaped like a very confident anatomical metaphor, while grandmothers nod respectfully and children wave miniature penises on sticks like it's a fertility-themed 4th of July. There are no whispers here, no euphemisms, just joy, steel, and some surprisingly intricate vegetables. The roots of it, deeper than you'd expect. Back in the Edo period, sex workers in the area began praying at the Kanayama shrine for protection from disease, from violence, from the unpredictable chaos of human intimacy. The deity enshrined there, Kanayama Heiko wasn't shy. He was a smithing god, but also a guardian of reproductive health. Sharp tools, smooth childbirth, and strong fertility all rolled into one divine portfolio. One story, decidedly apocryphal but too delightful to ignore, tells of a demon who lodged himself in a woman's vagina, biting off any suitor's member who dared enter. Practical demon, terrible dinner guest. Eventually, a clever blacksmith forged an iron phallus to break the curse, and voila, demon gone. Woman freed, shrine founded. The original prosthetic hero's journey. The modern festival draws people from around the world, tourists, pilgrims, bachelorette parties. It's loud, cheeky, irreverent, but beneath the humor lies that ancient impulse to sanctify what society so often hides, to laugh while honoring the sacredness of reproduction, to say, with candied genitals and karaoke, that sex is part of life, not its shameful little secret. And if you'd been born into this world, you might have marched in that parade, painted your face, bought a fertility charm shaped like a pickled daikon, maybe even whispered a quiet hope as the giant steel phallus rolled by on its sacred cart that you'd find love, or strength, or simply fewer awkward dates. Because fertility, after all, isn't just about babies, it's about life continuing, joy continuing. And sometimes, to keep that joy alive, you need to dress it up in silk, stick it on a cart, and let it ride through the streets like a rock star. But not every love rite is so playful. In other times, darker, colder, intimacy was distorted into accusation, female desire became evidence, and sex, once divine, became the devil's favorite party trick. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, if your timing had been a little worse, and your neighbors a little nosier. If you'd lived in early modern Europe, say, Germany, Scotland, or a particularly God-fearing Swiss canton, your relationship to love wouldn't have been shaped by longing or romance. It would have been shaped by firewood, parchment, and someone else's fever dream, because between the 15th and 18th centuries, being a woman with opinions, a man with herbs, or simply someone unmarried and vaguely eccentric could land you in court, accused not just of consorting with Satan, but doing it naked, on a broomstick mid-orgy. Yes, according to inquisitors with far too much imagination and not nearly enough sunlight, witches didn't just curse crops or make milk spoil. They danced with the devil, literally, often backwards, in the nude, sometimes during a full moon, sometimes on a Tuesday. The details changed. The erotic obsession, that part stayed. You see, Europe at the height of its spiritual anxiety couldn't stop thinking about sex, not healthy sex, not consensual, joyful, mutual sex, but corrupted sex, deviant, inverted, infernal sex. And since no one could prove the devil existed, they focused on proving who he had supposedly slept with. If you'd been there, you might have been accused of attending a sabbat, not the restful kind. This one involved feasts of unbaptized babies, flying genitals, and intimate encounters with horned deities who smelled suspiciously of goat and moral panic. The inquisitors asked questions like, "Did the devil kiss you?" And more importantly, "Where exactly on your body?" Hilariously specific answers were demanded. Under the left breast, inside the thigh. The devil, apparently, had a preference for obscure erogenous zones and extremely awkward court transcripts. And the confessions, oh, they flowed. Under torture, of course. People admitted to things they didn't understand, couldn't imagine, and had definitely never enjoyed. They confessed to carnality not because it happened, but because the world around them needed it to have happened. Needed someone to blame for the failing harvest, the sudden illness, the unexplainable desire. Because here's the thing. The witch craze wasn't really about witches. It was about control, about sex, about power, about women especially, whose independence, sensuality, or sheer survival in harsh times made them suspect. Wanting love, suspicious. Not wanting love, also suspicious. Owning a cat, dangerous. Owning your body, downright satanic. So if you'd lived then, and happened to be unmarried at 40, or unusually knowledgeable about root vegetables, or just a little too confident, you might have ended up confessing to things you'd only heard about in whispered rumors, all while chained to a cold wall, and praying the scribe had bad handwriting. And your legacy, not a wedding ring, not a love letter, a pile of ash and an accusation that you once lay with the horned one beneath a blasted oak. You, whose only real crime was knowing your worth, or tending your garden too well. But while Europe burned its lovers in disguise, other parts of the world whispered vows to spirits, not in fear, but in devotion. Because in the darkened corners of Haitian Vadu, love didn't disappear, it simply moved to the other side. You could have been married to someone no one else could see, someone who arrived in dreams, draped in silk and perfume, someone who asked for flowers and rum and a white lace veil, and in return offered protection, pleasure, and, just maybe, divine companionship. Because in Haitian Vadu, love doesn't stop at the human, it extends into the invisible, the shimmering, the spirit world, where the Elwa walk, and some of them are looking for something more than worship. They want partnership, they want fidelity, and they don't care that your aunt thinks you're single. If you had been born into this world, you might have found yourself face to face with Ursula Frida, goddess of love, luxury, and heartbreak. She doesn't marry just anyone, but when she does, you're expected to take it seriously. You'd have a wedding, real clothes, real cake, real guests, just one partner who's very much not physically present. Not all the time, anyway. And once you're married, the rules change. You keep an altar, you tend it, you give offerings, sweet things, elegant things, perfumed water, lipstick, champagne if you're fancy. And on her feast day, no intimacy with mortals. Your spirit spouse expects exclusivity at least one day a year. This isn't metaphor. This isn't just being devoted. It's an actual, contractual relationship. One that protects, demands, and sometimes interferes. If your spirit spouse is jealous, mortal relationships may sour. If you neglect them, you might fall ill. If you cheat, well, good luck sleeping. Spirit jealousy is rarely subtle. And it's not just Ursula. Others seek marriage too. Ogun, the iron-wielding warrior. Damballa, the serpent. Guide, the trickster of death and dirty jokes. Each comes with their own rights, their own preferences, their own rhythms. But all of them remind you that love isn't just carnal, it's cosmic, it's layered, and it never really ends. Because in Vadu, the dead aren't gone, the gods aren't distant, and the line between this world and the next is thin. Thinner still when music plays, smoke curls, and the Elwa ride the living like horses into dance, into speech, into laughter that isn't entirely your own. And you, possessed or chosen, might find yourself weeping into your wedding dress because something inside you remembers this spirit, this force, from long before you were born. That's the kind of love we're talking about, not flowers and poems, possession and pacts. But if the thought of marrying a spirit makes your modern sensibilities twitch, well, things could have been stranger, or rather, more intimate in a way Western minds still can't quite digest. Because somewhere, in a remote highland of Papua New Guinea, love, or rather, masculinity, wasn't inherited. It had to be transmitted, and not through words. Imagine what your life could have been if your childhood had ended not with a birthday, but with a ceremony involving bloodletting, isolation, and the belief that masculinity was a limited resource, one you had to earn, swallow, and never leak. High in the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea, among the Sambia people, love didn't begin with a kiss. It began with a purge. Because boys, they believed, were born polluted, full of maternal softness, dangerous levels of female. And if you wanted to become a man, truly, deeply, undeniably, you had to extract the woman from yourself. Step 1. Separation. At around age 7, you would have been taken from your mother, permanently. No more cuddling, no more nurture, just the men's lodge, dark, smoky, full of secrets and snot. There, older males would teach you how to be hard. Not emotionally, metaphorically, literally. Because in Sambia cosmology, strength came from semen. Not yours, you didn't make any yet. So to grow, to develop, to blossom into a warrior who could someday please a wife and honor the ancestors, you had to receive it. From those older boys. Regularly, ritualistically. Let that settle for a second. These acts weren't considered sexual. Not to them. Not in the Western sense. They were nutritional, sacred, necessary. Like vitamins, except the delivery method involved kneeling, obedience, and a deep sense that your body was being rewired for manhood. If you refused, you'd remain soft, weak, feminine. You wouldn't grow a beard. You'd embarrass your lineage. You'd rot. So you did it. Not with lust, with fear, with reverence, with the same feeling a child might have, swallowing bitter medicine, hoping it makes them strong before battle. Later, much later, you'd become the giver. When your time came, you'd pass it down like an heirloom. Not just fluid identity, lineage, cosmic fuel. That was the cycle. That was how men were made. And somewhere down the line, when you were finally considered complete, you'd take a wife. A girl not much older than you were when the initiations began. She'd be secluded, bled ritually, then slowly introduced to sex through a strict series of instructions, positions, and prayers designed to keep the power balanced, the spirits pleased, and the future fertile. Again, not about desire, about duty, structure, cosmology, the belief that bodhis don't just carry culture, they are culture. Living, leaking, transforming it. It's easy to recoil from this, to label it grotesque. But remember, your ideas of love, of consent, of maturity, they're just as constructed, just as fragile, and just as ritualized in their own modern way. The difference is, yours come with hashtags and dating apps. Theirs came with nosebleeds, ancestral pressure, and spears. And while this initiation might have been extreme, it wasn't the only place where love and ritual bled together. Some cultures carried romance into death, literally, where partnership didn't end with breath, but with birds and bones. Because if you'd been born among the roof of the world people, where the earth touches the sky, your union might have ended in the open air, with vultures, in the high plateaus of Tibet, where the land stretches so wide, the sky feels closer than the ground. Endings looked different. Here, death wasn't sealed in stone or hidden beneath flowers. It was unwrapped, exposed, accepted, and love, that final aching loyalty sometimes meant letting go of the person you adored. To the beaks of waiting birds, sky burials, they call them, Jeta, giving alms to the birds. And while they weren't about sex or intimacy in the usual sense, they were a form of ultimate union. The last ritual of the body, the last act of love. You and your partner might have walked this land together, shared barley, butter tea, and the long silences only altitude can explain. But when one of you died, there would be no embalming, no preservation. Instead, there'd be the ritualist, the Rogapa, standing in the wind with his stone blades and quiet concentration. The body, wrapped in white cloth, would be brought to a charnel site, open ground, high enough to echo. There, in front of sky and wind and waiting vultures, it would be respectfully disassembled, bones crushed, flesh sliced, blood offered, and the birds would come, huge, patient, efficient, bearded vultures with wings like sailcloth, circling once or twice before descending to feed, not to desecrate, to complete. Because in Tibetan Buddhist thought, the body isn't you, it's a vessel, a tool for karma, a temporary thing, like a borrowed coat, to be returned, recycled, devoured by sky. To cling to it would be a mistake, to fear its decay, a misunderstanding. So when lovers died, they didn't rest in sealed tombs or stone chambers. They returned to movement, their bones scattered across mountain winds, their blood recycled by creatures who knew no shame, and in some rare cases, whispered about more than recorded to lovers, might be buried this way together, laid side by side, returned to the vultures in tandem, a double offering, a joint exit. Not till death do us part, but through death we merge with sky. No one clapped, no speeches, no slow procession, just the wind, the chants, and a handful of monks muttering mantras against the howl. And perhaps, somewhere nearby, the surviving partner seated in stillness, watching, weeping not because the body was being taken, but because they finally understood, the person they loved was not in the body anymore. They never had been. It was a kind of release that made Western notions of romance, rings, vows, photo albums, feel oddly possessive. Here, the greatest devotion was letting someone go entirely, even the bones. But modern life doesn't often leave room for that kind of poetry. These days, sacred rites are trimmed down, filed away, or repackaged for profit. The body is hidden, the mystery sold in modules, and yet ancient rituals still echo in newer forms. Some in yoga studios, some in internet cults, some with incense and spreadsheets. Because sacred sex never really left, it just rebranded. It's still here. The sacredness, the mystery, the need to merge. But these days, it often arrives with a newsletter, a candle subscription, and an Instagram account promising enlightenment in 10 sensual steps. Neo-Tantra, they call it. Not the intricate scriptural tradition rooted in centuries of metaphysics, Sanskrit, and quiet discipline, but the Western remix, equal parts mysticism, breathwork, and very expensive pillows. You'd find it in a rented yurt behind a wellness retreat or a high-rise loft with salt lamps and branded mats. The language is smoother now, heart-opening, energetic realignment, divine masculine and feminine rebalancing, less karma, more marketing. And if you signed up for the retreat, packed your most breathable fabrics, and agreed to make prolonged eye contact with strangers over ceremonial cacao, you might feel something real. Because we are still creatures craving ritual, still aching for structure, still looking for someone to show us how to hold each other with meaning. But there's a catch. The sacred, once commodified, becomes slippery. A performance, a transaction. You paid for transformation, so it better feel transformative. You expect healing, so someone hands you a feather and says the word womb a lot until you start to believe them. And then there are the sex cults. The ones that begin in spiritual language and end in criminal charges. From California to Kerala, they follow the same old arc. A charismatic leader, a promise of awakening, a doctrine that blurs consent, and devotion until you're not sure whether you're transcending or just being manipulated in linen pants. NXIVM, one taste. The Temple of Tantra, different names, same formula. Ancient language, modern hierarchy. Sacred texts reinterpreted just enough to justify control. Your orgasm is blocked. They'll say, let me fix it. For a price, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Even the most beautiful rituals are vulnerable to power. The moment they're disconnected from community, from lineage, from accountability, they're ripe for abuse. And when love becomes a ladder to spiritual status, someone's always going to step on someone else to climb. But we still hunger for it. Not just sex, not just love, ritual. The sense that intimacy can mean something more than just biology and convenience. That there's a door we can open together, not into heaven, not into nirvana, but into each other, as sacred spaces. So we buy the books, light the incense, whisper mantras we don't fully understand. And sometimes, we do find real moments, a touch that feels ancient, a breath that aligns, a truth that slips between the jargon. Because even in its messiest, most commercial forms, the echo survives. The echo of rites performed around firelight, beneath stars, in languages now lost. The echo of bodies once considered sacred, of unions once considered cosmic. The echo of desire as something more than impulse, as invocation. But history has one final twist. A reminder that what we now call perversion was often just protocol. That the things we dismiss as strange or obscene were once revered, regulated, and ritualized. Because love, throughout history, was never just an emotion. It was architecture, a scaffold built from blood, incense, myth, law, longing, and the deep, unrelenting need to be seen, not just by another person, but by the gods themselves. Desire leaves a strange legacy, not in poems or heart-shaped jewelry, but in temple blueprints, dusty scrolls, and whispered regulations carved into the bones of society. For centuries, erotic rituals weren't a sideshow. They were central. They fed the crops, anchored dynasties, justified wars, made queens, unmade kings. They weren't optional. They were law. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always enforced. And if it makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is historical residue, because what we call perverted today was often required. Ritual intercourse, public consummation, ceremonial sacrifice stitched to honeymoon rites. These weren't taboos, they were obligations. You didn't ask if you felt ready. You did your duty, and hoped the gods didn't notice your hesitation. Desire was never private. It belonged to the gods, to the priests, to the village, to the ancestors. And when it was your turn, and it was always your turn, eventually, you performed it. With reverence, with fear, with cucumber offerings and lunar timing, and maybe, just maybe, a crowd watching. That's the thing myth does to love. It wraps it in symbols, elevates it, weaponizes it, and in the process strips it of softness. The moment intimacy gets ritualized, it stops being gentle. It becomes a transaction, a performance, a code you follow to avoid misfortune, or drought, or divine punishment. And even now, even with your dating apps and privacy settings and whispered declarations, echoes remain. In weddings, in purity rings, in laws that tell you who you can and can't love, and under what name. The rituals changed, the instinct didn't, because we are still, all of us, trying to touch something bigger than ourselves. to merge not just with a body, but with meaning. To be wanted, yes, but also chosen, blessed, witnessed, to be part of a story older than lust and longer than life. That's what these rites were. That's what they still are, hidden beneath the noise. Love, rewritten as myth, desire, rewritten as duty, and the body yours, mine, everyone's, caught in between, trying to remember whether it came here to feel or to serve. They weren't marrying for love. That would have been considered, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, dangerously indulgent. Love was a slippery, chaotic thing, something that could disrupt lineage, offend spirits, and interfere with cattle arrangements. Marriage, in many ancient tribal systems, wasn't a union between two individuals, but between two bloodlines, two cosmic roles, two carefully balanced positions within the social machinery. And children, well, they were simply born into it. They had no say in the matter, no time to consider alternatives, and certainly no room to dream. Among the Igbo of pre-colonial Nigeria, a man's bride wasn't chosen with whispers under moonlight, but with heavy discussions between elders, often punctuated by yams, schnapps, and silence. The girl might be 6, or 9, or 12, it didn't really matter. What mattered was her father's reputation, her mother's fertility history, and whether her lineage carried any curses or inconvenient ghost stories. Once all that was settled, a dowry was negotiated like one might haggle for a prized goat, except the goat had fewer expectations placed upon it. In the Andean highlands, the Quiros people practiced marriage as a tightly bound ritual exchange, almost algebraic in its calculations. Every union was a bridge, a connection between two alas or kin groups that allowed resources, labor, and ritual obligations to flow. A wedding was essentially a logistics operation wrapped in feathers and coca leaves. You didn't marry someone because your heart fluttered when they chewed quietly. You married because your marriage stabilized a valley. And if your heart fluttered later, fine. If it didn't, well, that was your problem, and preferably not a public one. Across the vast Pacific, on the Trabriand Islands, the famed anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski found that sexual freedom and emotional attachment were paradoxically abundant before marriage, but after the marriage rite, duty clamped down like a ritual conch. The girl, once playful and wild, was expected to fold herself into domestic patterns, while the boy was turned into a semi-functional cog in the yam exchange economy. It wasn't so much a descent into adulthood as a surrender. A cheerful, ceremonial one, perhaps, but surrender nonetheless. These weren't aberrations. They were systems, carefully maintained, cosmologically justified, and woven into the rhythm of daily life. To deviate was to risk not only scandal, but spiritual imbalance. An unarranged union could mean ancestral disapproval, failed harvests, or mysterious illness. Children were prepared early, subtly reminded that their body was not just theirs, but a communal asset to be negotiated and positioned. Choice was a modern infection. Back then, it was all about function, legacy, and symmetry. And while the mechanics varied from one culture to another, from Polynesian chiefdoms to Nilotic clans, the melody remained the same. Marriage wasn't about two people finding each other. It was about society folding in on itself, preserving its shape, reinforcing its spine. Yet even the most rigid structures need foundations, and the training began far earlier than the ceremony. Before the garlands, before the dowry, before the drumming and the dance, there were the trials, the rites of readiness, the strange symbolic deaths through which a child was reborn as someone marriageable, someone society could finally trust with inheritance, obedience, and silence. In the Amazon, marriage readiness had less to do with age and more to do with how much pain a body could endure without screaming. Among the Satamore boys were fitted with gloves woven from leaves, not just decorative, but filled with dozens of bullet ants, each delivering a sting likened to a gunshot to the nervous system. And it wasn't enough to survive it once. The initiation had to be repeated, again and again, not just to prove courage, but to numb the individual, to peel away whatever softness childhood had left behind. By the time a Sato boy reached the threshold of marriage, he didn't flinch. His hands knew agony, and his soul, ideally, had learned discipline. Girls, meanwhile, were taught a more silent sort of pain. Among the Tukuna menarche marked a descent into a liminal space. The girl would be secluded, often in a hut built for the occasion. Her body painted, her diet restricted, her voice softened. Visitors approached her like she was no longer human, which, for a time, she wasn't. She was in between. Her body had changed, and so too must her demeanor. When she emerged, days or even weeks later, she was transformed, posture controlled, movements graceful, eyes cast downward, marriageable. Among the Huitoto, readiness came in visions. Hallucinogenic brews like yage or ayahuasca weren't just for shamans. Children too were sometimes inducted, gently, deliberately, into altered states. There, they would meet ancestors, battle inner demons, or be taught what to expect from adulthood. Hardship, repetition, the occasional revelation. If a child returned from the spirit world changed quieter, more deliberate, the elders knew. They were almost ready. It wasn't only physical thresholds that mattered. The Pirahu, famous for their minimalist language and resistance to hierarchy, had no formal marriage ceremonies at all. But that didn't mean unions were casual. Instead, a girl's transition was marked through social recalibration. She would be courted, observed, tested. Could she laugh at a joke? Could she forage without complaint? Could she sleep in a hammock with another person and not weep from the loss of solitude? These were the signs of readiness. A quiet, almost invisible graduation into relational life, even among tribes with no concept of permanence in union, where divorce was as simple as walking away. The preparation for first marriage still carried ritual weight, because it wasn't about fidelity. It was about fit. A girl or boy, once deemed ready, was not merely allowed to marry, they were expected to. And marriage, even when impermanent, was the social test one had to pass before becoming someone who mattered. No one asked how they felt. That came later, if at all. First came the transformation, the body, the skin, the voice, all reshaped into tools for survival in adult society. And somewhere between the ant bites and the isolation huts, between the psychedelic dreams and the soft footsteps into womanhood, a strange lesson was learned, that readiness isn't about enthusiasm. It's about disappearing into a role so completely, the world forgets who you were before. But to disappear properly, the body had to be marked. Childhood had to be burned off, sometimes literally, and replaced with symbols that told the village, this person has suffered. This person is no longer a child. And so began the long, painful art of preparing the flesh, carving, piercing, filing, painting, not for beauty, but for belonging. Here is a kind of memory that lives in the skin. And in many tribal worlds, the skin had to be rewritten, torn, inked, or reshaped, before a person could be trusted with the rituals of adulthood. Childhood was considered unfinished, not just in mind, but in flesh. To be eligible for marriage, one had to bleed in the right places, wear the right scars, and carry the pain of others visibly, like a garment stitched beneath the dermis. In parts of Papua New Guinea, boys of the Sepik River tribes were sliced with razor-sharp bamboo along the arms, back, and chest, to mimic the texture of a crocodile's hide. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of cuts. No anesthetic, no complaint. Crocodiles, they believed, were ancestors. And a boy who endured the pain and healed properly became one with his lineage, his baby skin discarded like an old spirit. Only then could he begin to think about becoming a man, and eventually, a husband. In East Africa, among groups like the Poket or Rendel, girls underwent another transformation. Their bodies were not scarified, they were reduced. Through breast ironing or female circumcision, the signs of blooming femininity were either delayed or sharply defined, depending on the context. A girl might be held down by ants, her face covered in ochre, her body trembling while the operation was performed with stone, bone, or, in later years, rusted razor blades. The ritual was rarely explained. It didn't need to be. It was tradition. And tradition, the gods, didn't answer questions. Among the Quiapo of Brazil, children were adorned with geometric tattoos and intricate body paint. The ink wasn't just aesthetic, it was cosmological. Each line marked a stage. Each spiral told the spirits, this child is shifting, shedding old energies, stepping toward new obligations. The body became a map, and when the painting was complete, the child was no longer simply seen, they were interpreted. To outsiders, these practices often appear barbaric, but that misses the point. The pain wasn't meant to be punitive, it was transformative. A symbolic death, a burning of the old self to make way for something sturdier, more reliable. Someone who could marry without trembling, carry children without hesitating, bury parents without falling apart, and the transformation was rarely private. It was staged, often in public, often loudly, always deliberately. The screams, when allowed, weren't signs of weakness, but punctuation marks in a collective story. Grandmothers watched, fathers nodded, little cousins peeked through branches, absorbing the choreography of pain. They too would someday dance. It wasn't enough to look mature. One had to prove it. Teeth were filed into points. Skin was stretched by lip plates. Noses were pierced. Necks elongated. Spines tattooed. Each modification was a sentence in a language that only the tribe could read. A declaration that said, "I've endured. I belong. I am ready to be given away." And once the body was prepared, once the softness was singed and the silence installed, came the real training, the one that didn't show. The posture, the ritualized deference, the emotional rehearsal for a life of roles. Girls learned the art of disappearing behind gestures. Boys learned the weight of watching without blinking. And both were taught that love was a luxury, but submission, strength, and silence, those were sacred. The training wasn't always loud. After the tattoos had dried and the blood had crusted, after the swelling went down and the fevers broke, what came next was quieter, a long, dull shaping of the spirit into something more useful. Children who had once shouted across rivers or chased lizards barefoot now moved with deliberate restraint. Posture mattered, timing mattered, and above all, knowing when to speak or not to became a form of survival. In many Bantu-speaking societies, girls were taken into initiation camps out of sight of men, out of earshot of play, and taught how to carry water without spilling, how to kneel without noise, how to prepare meals in absolute sequence. There was a rhythm to it all, a choreography of submission passed down in whispers. Older women watched, corrected, withheld praise. Every mistake, a lesson. Every lesson, a stitch in the cloak of adulthood. It wasn't all domesticity. In the Omo Valley of Ethiopia, boys were led through cattle camps and instructed in endurance, decision-making, and controlled violence. One day, they would inherit herds, but before that, they had to endure cold nights, cracked skin, and the indignity of failing in front of men who pretended not to notice. Emotion was salt in open wounds. The less shown, the stronger you were. In these systems, strength wasn't about conquest, it was about containment. A boy who could take a beating without blinking, who could slit a goat's throat cleanly, who could stare down an elder without flinching, that boy was ready to be paired, to carry lineage. And if he couldn't, well, there were ways to make him quieter. In Vanuatu, female initiation sometimes included days of isolation, during which girls were forbidden from seeing their families, speaking their names, or hearing music. When they emerged, they walked differently, not because of pain, but because of watchfulness. They had become aware of their own presence and its danger. A woman who laughed too loudly might be mistaken for someone still childish. A wife must be serene, silent, useful. And in the hill tribes of Southeast Asia, such as the Hmong or ACA children, were taught the language of faces, what to reveal, what to hide. A glance too long could offend. A smile at the wrong time could imply availability. So they practiced with their siblings, with goats, with shadows, until their expressions told only what was safe. Marriage wasn't just a joining of two bodies, it was the union of two masks, two controlled performances, two trained reflexes. For boys, it meant the pressure to protect without complaint. For girls, the expectation to serve without breaking. And both roles were rehearsed for years, until the performance became indistinguishable from the self. But even the best performances relied on script, and the script always came from someone older, someone watching, someone with the power to arrange, to promise, to trade. Because in the end, readiness meant nothing without permission, and permission was given not by the heart, but by the elders, who calculated readiness in cows, land, and timing. And so, the arranged unions began. There was no age of consent, not in the legal sense, not in the sense of individual will. Consent, if it existed at all, belonged to the collective, the clan, the elders, the ancestors, the spirits of rivers and harvest. A child did not choose, a child was chosen, and readiness, in most ancient tribes, wasn't measured by birthdays but by signs. A girl's hips widening, a boy's voice cracking, a certain stillness in the eyes. These were the cues. Nature spoke, and society obeyed. In ancient Mesopotamia, marriage contracts could be drawn up when a girl was as young as 5, though the marriage itself would be delayed until puberty. The agreement wasn't about affection, it was about inheritance, irrigation rights, the strategic alliance of barley fields. Fathers signed clay tablets with cuneiform solemnity. The child, meanwhile, practiced carrying jugs or counting goats, unaware that her future had already been exchanged for a better fence. Among the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, elders would observe girls as they neared puberty, not for their opinions, but for their potential. If her weaving was neat, if her chores were done without reminders, if her posture pleased the aunties, then discussions began. Not with her, of course. With her father, her uncles, perhaps a neighbor with a promising son, and several heads of cattle to spare. Cattle, in this case, were more than property. They were the measure of her worth. She was not being sold. That would be vulgar. She was being honored through negotiation. In the Himalayan regions, such as among the Bhotia or parts of Ladakh, polyandrous marriages were once common, particularly fraternal polyandry, where one woman would marry several brothers. Land was scarce, and this arrangement kept property from fragmenting. A girl might not know which brother she would spend the night with, but that wasn't the point. The point was balance, pragmatism, the continuation of a stable roof, even in matrilineal societies like the Minangkabau of Sumatra, where women owned property and lineage flowed through mothers. The arrangements were still not about desire. A woman might inherit the house, but her husband moved in under strict conditions. The marriage was strategic, often facilitated by maternal uncles who weighed character, skill, and spiritual compatibility. Love, again, was a luxury, one that bloomed after the deal was done, if at all. Marriage wasn't a door to freedom, it was a placement, like a game piece moved across a sacred board, and those who moved it, the elders, the priests, the parents, did so with utter conviction. They weren't cruel, they believed. They believed that love was unreliable, but alliance was sacred, that spirits didn't care about longing, but they did care about timing, that a child, no matter how clever, was not wise enough to decide whom to bind their blood to, and so the ceremonies were set, the chants prepared, the dowries wrapped in banana leaves or goat skins, the bride, adorned in beads and obligation, the groom, fumbling with his spear or his smile, depending on the custom, and the union arranged, sealed, sanctified, became irreversible, not because the couple had said yes, but because the village had. But not everyone followed the script. Not everyone knelt when told. There were those few, forgotten, often punished, who refused the marriage mat, who broke the ritual silence, who ran into the forest instead of the arms of a stranger, and some of them, somehow, survived. The rules were carved in bark and blood, but even the most ancient codes cracked. Every society, no matter how tightly woven, produces its phrase. The outliers, the refusers, the ones who step out of formation. Sometimes they vanish into myth. Sometimes they survive long enough to be remembered by name. But more often, they become whispers, cautionary or sacred, depending on who's telling the story. In the forests of pre-colonial Angola, girls who resisted marriage could seek sanctuary in the bush, where they became Nganga healers, mediums, dangerous women who answered to no man but the spirits. To flee an arranged marriage was to risk death, but to become a vessel for ancestral power, that made a different kind of wife, one married to the dead, to wind, to thunder. The bride price was madness, but the reward was freedom. Among the Navajo, marriage customs traditionally allowed a surprising degree of choice, but that didn't mean there were no expectations. Still, records, oral and colonial, speak of women who walked away, who unwrapped their wedding blankets and returned them, who claimed their weaving tools and refused to share their cornmeal, and the village adapted, quietly, without scandal. Some cracks were simply absorbed into the design. In the southern islands of the Philippines, among the Tausig or Simabajau, there were those who broke engagements and disappeared into the sea, literally, escaping on boats, joining coastal nomads, renaming themselves under new stars. A girl promised to a sultan's nephew might instead become a pearl diver, lungs burning, limbs strong, alone and alive. Rebellion didn't always look like a sword. Often, it was subtler. A refusal to menstruate on time, feigned illness, intentional clumsiness in domestic tasks. In parts of West Africa, among the Yoruba girls were sometimes said to be touched by spirits if they failed to adapt to marital training. Possession, in these cases, was not a diagnosis. It was protection. A performance, maybe, a cry for delay, a strategy to buy time from the inevitable. Boys, too, had their ruptures. A boy who failed to complete his scarification, who cried during the ant glove ritual, who ran from the initiation hut, he might be sent to live with maternal relatives, his future redrawn, his marriage prospects dimmed. But in some traditions, that softness wasn't shameful. It was rerouted. He might become a spiritual intermediary, or in rare cases, a third gender figure revered, feared, exempt. Then there were the lovers, the ones who met in the wrong village, who wrote their longing in footprints across forbidden trails, who tried to reshape lineage with whispered promises. Some were caught and flogged, others were banished. A few became ballads, sung low and slow by old women with missing teeth and very good memories. But rebellion never came without consequence. To reject the system was to live on the edge of it, unanchored, hungry, watched. Yet even in the harshest societies, there was a strange room for them, a half-respected space for the disobedient, because deep down, everyone knew the script needed tension, the marriage rites needed contrast, the tribe needed its ghosts and its runaways. Still, most didn't run, most obeyed, most bore the weight without question. And when the ceremonies ended, when the anklets were removed, the body paint washed off, the guests dismissed, what remained was a silence filled with expectation, a life that now had to be lived, in the rhythms of repetition, in the cradle of duties, in the slow inheritance of sorrow and survival. But the past, as always, lingers, and some of those rituals softened, renamed, recontextualized, still echo in the present, because while the drums may have quieted, not every marriage rite has gone extinct. In certain corners of the world, the rituals never quite ended. They merely changed their clothing. The isolation huts became boarding schools. The arranged unions became family expectations. The dowries got rebranded as wedding gifts, still negotiated in whispers between parents, now dressed as tradition. And the pain, well, the pain adapted. In parts of rural South Asia, child marriage remains not a shadow of the past, but a present tense. Girls as young as 10 are still betrothed, not by choice but by climate, drought, debt, the unbearable arithmetic of poverty. A young girl might be traded to settle a feud, to protect a brother, or simply because she eats less than a grown woman and complains less than a teenage boy. Governments ban it, NGOs weep, but in the village, nothing has changed. The gods still prefer quiet brides. In Ethiopia's Amhara region, the Telefar tradition, abduction for marriage, persisted well into the 21st century. A man would seize the girl he wanted, sometimes with friends, and bring her to his home. If she stayed the night, she was considered his wife. Consent wasn't part of the vocabulary. Elders would step in, not to punish, but to bless. What began as a crime was transfigured into a wedding. Not every tribe needed a ritual. Sometimes, all it took was silence. Even in the heart of modern cities, the ghost of the rite lingers. In immigrant communities in Europe or North America, marriage can still be a negotiation between two sets of parents, who shake hands in restaurants and refer to their children's futures like pieces of property wrapped in ambition. A university degree becomes a new form of bride price. A visa becomes a dowry. The rituals are legal now, even polite, but the choreography remains oddly familiar. And then there are the cosmetic echoes, the body as proof of readiness. Girls still flatten their stomachs, bleach their skin, walk with keys between their knuckles. Boys still train themselves not to cry, not to confess, not to falter. The training has gone digital, but the message is ancient. Become someone others will want to bind themselves to, or be left behind. In some places, efforts to undo the damage have become rituals in themselves. Activists now perform counter-rites, mass girl education programs, community theater against child marriage, public burnings of symbolic wedding garments. The aim is not to mock tradition, but to disarm it, to replace fear with visibility, to carve a new narrative where consent is not a luxury, but a birthright. But culture doesn't dissolve on command. It curls into new shapes, hides behind symbols, waits. In some West African villages, the practice of spiritual marriage still binds girls to ancestral figures or deities, often through a priest, who claims them as wives in dreams. These girls live in shrines, serve spirits, and are rarely allowed to leave. It's not called marriage, but it binds like one. And in certain Christian, Muslim, and Hindu communities, arranged marriages persist, not as coercion, but as sacred duty. Many defend the practice. Not every arrangement is a trap. Some grow into love, some don't, but the structure remains. The child waits, the family decides, the ceremony begins. The dance, for better or worse, continues. Even as the modern world debates ethics, autonomy, and freedom, the ancient rhythms tap beneath the surface. Because marriage, in its oldest form, wasn't a personal story, it was architecture, a way to build, to stabilize, to appease. And while we've changed the bricks and the blueprints, the foundations are still visible in laws, in language, in the strange, familiar silence before a girl says yes. Spirits have always been invasive. That's part of their charm, or their threat, depending on how one fares in altered states. Across cultures, across millennia, the act of being possessed by something non-human was rarely a gentle suggestion. It came in convulsions, in sweat, in whispers that slithered behind the eardrum. And for the shaman, that possession was a kind of erotic contract, inked not with ink, but with breath, tremor, and saliva. There's no polite way to say it. The divine got handsy. In Siberia, it wasn't uncommon for a spirit to claim a young initiate, not just as an apprentice, but as a spouse. A being with no face and 1,000 names might visit in sleep, mount the dreamer with the persistence of a jealous lover, and demand fidelity that outlasted the waking hours. The result? Power, yes, but also shame, secrecy, and a body permanently rearranged to accommodate something invisible. Among the Inuit, Angkor transpossession often came with deep physical release, muscles twitching, eyes rolling, limbs frozen in a kind of ecstatic rigor, not unlike what might occur behind closed doors in more secular circumstances. But these moments weren't private. The community watched. They wanted to know if the spirit had spoken, and whether the vessel had survived. The boundary between holy and indecent was, at best, theoretical. In Southeast Asia, spirit mediums would often undergo bodily feminization, their movements softening, their voices lifting, their pelvises undulating in dance. The possession itself could look suspiciously like seduction. Sometimes, the spirit would only arrive after hours of drumming, chanting, and hip movements that would put most nightclubs to shame. And, if it entered, the medium collapsed, gasping, as though overwhelmed by something deeply familiar. Even in West African Vodun traditions, where ritual order is sacred, the gods had preferences. Some orishas would only possess women, others demanded men dressed in skirts. The body had to be prepared, not just in cleanliness, but in suggestion. Certain beads, certain oils, certain rhythms were known to please a deity into descending. The dance was foreplay, the trance, consummation, and once the god was in, well, the shaman wasn't quite in control anymore. Their mouth spoke, but the words belonged elsewhere. Their spine bent, but under the weight of a will that wasn't theirs. And that merging, messy, loud, often erotic in undertone, was considered the height of sacred contact. It wasn't symbolic. No one described it as metaphor. A spirit didn't whisper gentle guidance from the clouds. It entered the body. It used it, sometimes for healing, sometimes for prophecy, sometimes, and this is where things got complicated, for pleasure. But the line was always thin. The difference between divine rapture and spiritual assault was rarely discussed aloud. Some initiates went mad. Others grew addicted to possession, unable to sleep without dreaming of their spirit consorts, unable to be touched by humans without guilt. The body had been colonized, and not every colonist left when asked. Still, despite the chaos, the erotic remained central to the shamanic identity. Power didn't descend like lightning. It arrived like a slow, warm fever, a rising heat, a loosening of the tongue, a vulnerability mistaken for seduction. And in that moment, trembling, open, empty, the shaman became more than a healer. They became a threshold. And deep in the Amazon, that threshold was guarded by serpents. The forest didn't hide its appetite. In the upper Amazon, visions didn't arrive wearing halos. They slithered, hissed, and pulsed with color so intense it felt carnal. For the Iwasqueros, the shamans of the vine, erotic encounters with spirit beings weren't unusual. In fact, they were expected. What surprised outsiders was not that the visions were vivid, but that they had hips. The brew itself, made from Banistirups's copy and chacruna leaves, didn't just open a door. It pried it wide and invited in whatever lurked on the other side. Sometimes that meant ancestral jaguars, other times glowing anacondas, but often the visitor was a woman. Not a normal one. Her skin shimmered, her voice echoed like water over bones, and her body seemed to undulate with the rhythm of the vines themselves. She didn't ask permission. She came to teach, and she taught with her hands, her eyes, her teeth. These encounters, part trance, part erotic hallucination, were not dismissed as distractions. They were instruction. Many shamans described them as initiations, encounters where the spirit of the plant would test the shaman's readiness. If he flinched, she disappeared. If he resisted, the vision turned to nightmare. But if he surrendered, she gave him knowledge, visions of healing songs, the shape of a disease's spirit. Sometimes, entire languages of plants passed through a kiss. In Shipibo traditions, the serpentine goddess wasn't just one being, she was many. Mother of medicines, guardian of the underworld, seductress of the unworthy. She was called Yushin, or sometimes Ronin, and her coils stretched through both body and cosmos. She didn't walk, she wrapped, around spines, around minds, around loins. Shamans spoke of her arriving at night, coiling around their hammocks, breathing hot air into their nostrils, filling their dreams with fluids that felt suspiciously real upon waking. Celibacy didn't protect them. In fact, it seemed to invite her more often. Desire, after all, is a form of emptiness. And the forest doesn't like voids. For these practitioners, human intimacy was seen as mundane, even disruptive. The real union, the one that mattered, was with the spirit wife. Marrying a mortal woman was possible, but only if she didn't mind competing with a being who lived in vines, songs, and wet dreams. Some women left. Others learned the Ikaros, the healing chants, and tried to coexist. Not all succeeded. During ceremonies, it wasn't uncommon to see the shaman dance in place, hips swaying, tongue flicking, sweat pouring down his chest like he was being touched by invisible hands. And in a way, he was. The goddess didn't need a body. She had his. And everyone in the Maloka knew it. But power had its price. Those who rejected the goddess, who took her gift and ran, often found themselves haunted. Visions turned sour. Illness arrived in strange places. Erections came at the wrong times. Children were born without dreams. The serpent, once scorned, was never merciful. Still, they kept drinking, kept inviting her back, because without her, the forest fell silent. And a silent forest is far more terrifying than one that moans. In Siberia, though, the moaning came from elsewhere, through the thick ice and into the tent, where another kind of bride waited. Up north, where the trees grow sparse and the ground never truly softens, spirits didn't descend in vines. They came through the wind, in dreams thick with frost and fur. For Siberian shamans among the Ewenki, the Chukchi, the Yakut, erotic initiation didn't require a potion. It required patience, and a willingness to be claimed in sleep. It often began with a dream. Not the usual nonsense of teeth falling out, or flying naked over frozen rivers, but something heavy. A stranger would arrive, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes something in between. They wore no name, but their touch was unmistakable. The dreamer wouldn't simply watch. They'd feel a pressure on the chest, a breath on the neck, a kiss that stung like a warning. These spirit wives or husbands, depending on the dreamer's fate, were more than recurring visions. They were contracts. The shaman was no longer fully theirs. They belonged to another plane now, tethered by a relationship that couldn't be severed by ritual or divorce. The bond was sealed by lust, not ceremony. In the waking world, this meant abstinence. Sort of. Many shamans abstained from human intimacy, fearing it would anger their spirit spouse. Others tried to balance both. A wife at home, a wife in the sky. That rarely went well. There were tales of women waking to find their shaman husbands writhing alone on the floor, whispering in languages that hurt to hear. Sometimes the spirit wife grew jealous. Sometimes she sent illness as a reminder. Once, she tore open a tent in a snowstorm just to be noticed again. To be possessed in the dream was not a metaphor. The physical signs lingered, bite marks, bruises, scratches in places no one could reach. These weren't lies. They were proof. The community believed. How could they not, when the shaman could name illnesses without touching, predict deaths by scent, or summon wind with a whistle. The erotic was woven into the role. It wasn't discussed, but it pulsed beneath every ritual. The drumbeat mimicked the rhythm of hips. The trance followed the same arc as arousal: build-up, climax, collapse. The spirit entered, the body opened, the message came. And when it was over, the shaman lay still, like someone post-coital, eyes wide, fingers twitching. Even the clothes hinted at something in between. Some male shamans wore braids, skirts, women's coats, not as disguise, but as invitation. The spirits, they said, preferred ambiguity. A fixed gender was a closed door. But a liminal body, part man, part woman, part animal, part empty, now that was an irresistible temple. These dream marriages could last a lifetime. Some shamans died without ever having known a human lover. Others left widows, and a spectral mistress still lingering in their furs. The line between spirit and spouse blurred, until even they forgot who had touched them first. But not every initiation came in whispers. Some came in flame. Pain, deliberately courted, became the bridge between the sacred and the sensual, and across it, shamans walked willingly, begging to be broken. Before the trance, there was pain. Not the accidental kind, not the stubbed toe or the scraped knee, but deliberate, orchestrated suffering. For many shamanic traditions, pain wasn't a barrier to mysticism. It was the price of admission. The soul, they believed, didn't rise until the body had been humbled. And nothing humbled the body like ritual torment, especially when it flirted with desire. Among the Yakut aspirant shamans were said to undergo a kind of cosmic butchery in visions. Dismembered by spirits, their bones boiled, their flesh peeled and eaten. They awoke, exhausted, drenched in sweat, and somehow purified. This wasn't symbolic. They felt it. Their bodies bore no wounds, but their voices cracked for days. The pain wasn't real, but it left marks anyway. Further south, in Mongolic tribes, the physical trials took place in the waking world. Novice shamans were bound in furs and left to sweat out the spirits. Others were whipped by elders in rhythmic patterns, the strikes meant to loosen the spirit trapped in the spine. The body twitched, moaned, bent. Somewhere in that blur of shame and ecstasy, a door opened. In South American rites, particularly among the Matsis, and Ashaninka initiation often involved plant toxins rubbed into cuts. Not hallucinogens, but pure, cruel stimulants. Eyes bulged, tongues swelled, breathing became a labor. The body writhed, not in vision, but in agony. And when the pain peaked, when the body seemed moments from rupture, the shaman sang a new song, one they had never heard before. A song the plants gave in return for the blood. And then there were the less sanctioned methods, the ones whispered about, not recorded. Shamans who pierced themselves in private, who danced until their feet blistered, who rubbed nettles into their thighs before trance. Pain sharpened the threshold. It stripped away distraction, ego, modesty. It made the body beg to be left. And in that emptying, something else entered. The overlap between pain and arousal was not lost on them. It wasn't discussed in polite terms, but then, politeness has never been sacred. They knew that a shiver down the spine could mean cold, or fear, or longing. That the tremble before climax and the tremble before possession were, structurally speaking, not so different. Both involved surrender. Both left the body open, exposed, waiting to be filled. Some initiations required silence. Others demanded moans. In certain tantric-adjacent Himalayan traditions, the practitioner was bound, blindfolded, left without food or water, not as punishment, but as preparation. The goal was not to endure, but to crack, to lose control, to let the self dissolve into something wetter, stranger, more sacred. There were cases too many to dismiss of initiates falling in love with their suffering, not masochism in the modern sense, but reverence. They knew which rituals made their blood rush, which chants made their chest ache in that specific, delicious way. Some never reached trance without it. The pain was the key. And like any addict, they kept returning to the lock. But even the deepest scars couldn't protect the body from temptation. Because when the trials ended, and the power settled in, the shaman became dangerous. Not just spiritually, but physically, to themselves, to others. Because now they were forbidden to touch, yet saturated with touch. Celibate, yet constantly aroused. Hollowed out, yet full of fire. And desire, unspent, always finds a way to leak. Once possessed, the body stopped belonging to itself. It became a shrine, or worse, a public utility. In many traditions, a shaman's flesh was considered too sacred, or too volatile to be touched casually. They were told to abstain, not because they were above desire, but because their desire was dangerous, too entangled with the divine. One climax at the wrong moment, they said, could anger the spirits or unravel years of ritual preparation. And so, celibacy became currency. In parts of Central Africa, Nganga were expected to live alone or sleep on mats woven from specific plants that cooled the loins. Their bodies were constantly monitored for signs of transgression. An unexpected erection could be blamed on demonic interference, a wet dream, an invitation for public cleansing. Desire wasn't something to be managed, it was something to be suppressed, punished, exercised. Among the Sami Noadi, celibacy wasn't always enforced, but any sexual relationship had to be negotiated with the spirits first. The idea of asking a lover's permission was quaint. The real question was whether the gods approved, and they were known to be possessive. Jealousy, it seems, is not limited to the living. Some shamans tried to cheat the rules. Quiet affairs, hurried moments behind smoke lodges, fingers that wandered when the drumming got too intense. But the consequences came quickly. Lost visions, blighted crops, sudden illness. It was said that a shaman who indulged without spiritual consent would lose their voice, not metaphorically, but literally. The gods would snatch it mid-chant and leave behind a stammer. And yet, the body remembered, even while fasting, even while covered in ash, even after weeks of silence. It pulsed, it itched, it dreamed. Arousal became a kind of haunting, no longer physical, but spectral. Some described it as a heat in the belly, others as a buzzing in the pelvis that no touch could soothe. The spirit lover always watched, and mortal hands could not compare. Still, not every shaman obeyed. Some took lovers in secret. Some fell in love, disastrously, beautifully, publicly. There are stories, scattered and half-suppressed, of a shaman whose partner died mysteriously after a forbidden night. The spirits, they said, didn't share. There were also tales of shamans who lost their power entirely, who became ordinary overnight, visionless, songless, just a body again. But for a few, the transgression itself became sacred. In parts of the Himalayas, certain tantric practitioners believed that real, physical union, could unlock divine power. That orgasm, properly directed, could crack the skull open just wide enough for a god to slip in. Of course, this was heresy to most. But heresy, like lust, tends to survive purification rituals, so they lived in paradox, forbidden from touch, yet trained in intimacy with the invisible. Their bodies untouchable, yet constantly read, for signs, for omens, for tremors. They became performances of restraint, and restraint, like desire, is a kind of theater, especially when everyone is watching to see if you'll fail. But trance made it worse, because when the body danced, when it shook and swayed and opened without warning, it didn't always obey the rules. The cosmos, it turned out, had erogenous zones too. The body in trance doesn't ask permission. It arches, collapses, moans, trembles, and no one quite knows whether it's sacred or obscene. For shamans, these movements weren't choreographed. They were responses to rhythm, to heat, to things no one else could see. And the cosmos, when it finally slipped inside, didn't do so politely. It arrived like an overwhelming lover, sudden, invasive, intimate. Across cultures, trance wasn't simply a tool, it was a terrain, and it was navigated through the body. Drums didn't just keep time, they seduced, they pulled breath into the pelvis, spun the spine, and teased the knees into collapse. The body became a tuning fork for something vast and vibrating, and in that vibration, something deeply erotic stirred. In Haitian Vedu ceremonies, possession came with full-body engagement. The Elwa, when they entered, didn't settle quietly. They made their vessels dance wildly, sometimes lasciviously, touching, grinding, weeping with pleasure or rage. Some gods smoked cigars through their borrowed mouths, others demanded kisses. It wasn't always pretty, but it was real, and unmistakably physical. In parts of India, particularly among tantric sects, trance states were built like a slow breathing, precise gestures, mantras chanted until the syllables melted. The kundalini, that coiled serpent of energy, was said to rise up the spine like heat climbing a wick. If done properly, the awakening could trigger visions. If done improperly, it could unhinge the mind. Either way, The metaphor wasn't subtle. The universe, they claimed, had its own body, its own secret places. Arouse it correctly, and it would reveal its mysteries. Ignore its pleasure, and it would remain closed. Shamans were, in a way, lovers of the cosmos, coaxing it into ecstasy with their breath and sweat. And ecstasy, real ecstasy, was indistinguishable from surrender. Some shamans collapsed mid-ritual, drooling, mumbling, drenched. They weren't ashamed. This was contact, a full-bodied handshake between dimensions. That it looked like the aftershocks of orgasm was not coincidence. In Indonesia's kuda lumping rituals, dancers enter trance states after ritual consumption of incense, smoke and chants. They writhe on the ground, chew glass, lash themselves with whips, and often they smile through the blood. Spectators watch, half horrified, half envious. The dancer has become more than human. They are being touched by something else. And the trance didn't stop at movement. It rewrote identity. Gender became fluid. Age dissolved. A young boy could channel an old woman. A woman could suddenly speak in the voice of a warrior. Some shamans even claimed to become animals mid-trance, panting, howling, growling with desire they couldn't name. The line between possession and pleasure blurred. Sometimes the spirit moaned. Sometimes the shaman did. No one asked which was which. That wasn't the point. The goal wasn't to control the experience. It was to survive it. But in these moments of collapse, of cosmic exposure, something else became possible. Something queerer. Something that didn't fit neatly into the roles the world expected. Because some shamans, after enough trances, began to walk differently, to speak differently, to desire differently. And the spirits didn't seem to mind. When a shaman came back from trance and didn't walk the same, the village took notice. Not because they stumbled, but because they moved with a new kind of balance. Neither man nor woman, neither young nor old. Something else, something slippery. And in most places, that slipperiness wasn't punished. It was revered. The spirits, it seemed, preferred ambiguity. Among the Bugis of Sulawesi, the Bisu, a sacred gender that encompassed all and none, were the spiritual elite. To be Bisu meant embodying both male and female energies in one body, not in halves, but in full. They performed blessings, led ceremonies, and served as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Their gender wasn't deviant. It was a conduit, and often an erotic one. In Native American traditions, especially among the Lakota, Navajo, and Zuni, two-spirit people held ritual power precisely because they didn't conform. They weren't confused. They were chosen. Some wore women's clothes, others men's. Some alternated. Some invented something entirely new. Their sexuality wasn't a side note. It was folded into their function. A two-spirit might take lovers, male or female or otherwise, not as rebellion, but as ritual balance. Spirit possession blurred the boundaries even further. A male medium might be inhabited by a female deity, and in doing so, move like her, speak with her pitch, flirt with her eyes. In Thailand's spirit festivals, such transformations are common. The body becomes elastic, gender becomes choreography, and the crowd doesn't flinch. They know who's speaking, and it's not the one wearing the skin. In Polynesian traditions, Mahu figures often served as healers, teachers, and keepers of ritual knowledge. Their femininity didn't cancel their masculinity, it enriched it. They were not in transition, they were in orbit, and the erotic was part of the offering. Their desirability was dangerous, sacred, sometimes whispered about, sometimes envied. The spirits didn't seem to pick based on gender anyway. They chose bodies that could hold contradictions without breaking, that could ache with longing and still carry out the ritual, that could love without claiming, that could open over and over without demanding permanence. And shamans, especially those with fluid identities, lived in constant openness. Their boundaries were thin, their nights often dream-soaked, their desires hard to classify. Some fell in love with the spirits that possessed them. Some never fully returned to one gender, or one voice, or one preference. They became many, and that multiplicity wasn't seen as a flaw. It was a kind of divine shape-shifting. But multiplicity comes with cost. The more fluid the self, the harder it is to contain. Some shamans drowned in their contradictions. Others were feared not for what they did, but for what they might awaken in others. A touch too tender, a gaze too long, a story that stirred something forgotten. Still, they were needed, because only someone who had been undone could help others unravel. and sometimes unraveling was the only path to healing. But not every story ends in balance. Some end in obsession, possession that overstayed, spirits that refused to leave, and desire that grew teeth. Some spirits don't leave, not politely, anyway. They settle in the chest, coil around the spine, under the skin. And when the shaman forgets the difference between invitation and infestation, things begin to rot. Not visibly, not at first. The chants still work. The healings still happen. But behind the eyes, something starts to fray. Among the Orokan of northeastern China, shamans were known to be chosen by sickness. But sometimes, the sickness stayed. A healer who once entered trance with control might begin to slip mid-sentence, muttering erotic confessions between blessings. They'd forget the boundaries between human and spirit, between ritual and reality, between touch and transgression. Not always violently. Sometimes it looked like longing, sometimes like mania. There are stories, not parables, but recollections of shamans who fell hopelessly in love with their spirit spouses. They stopped eating. They refused human contact. They became thin, luminous, unbearable to look at. One even built a shrine out of fish bones and teeth, claiming it was a gift for his bones, who lived in her dreams and would punish any man who tried to touch her. The villagers stopped knocking. Others went the opposite direction, using their spiritual authority to justify indulgence. In 19th century Siberia, there were accounts of shamans who demanded sex from followers during rituals, claiming it was the will of the spirits. Some believed them, others fled. The line between sacred eros and sacred abuse blurred fast, especially when ecstasy and obedience shared the same vocabulary. Jealous spirits were another problem. A shaman who dared to take a mortal lover might wake up choking or find blood in the washbowl. In some Yakut communities, it was said that the spirits would strangle a child in the womb if the shaman's body was shared improperly. Some refused to have children at all, just to be safe. And when the madness came, when the power turned sour, no one knew what to do. You couldn't strip a shaman of their spirits like a badge. The same trance that had once healed now spilled nonsense, profanity, shrieking laughter. The community would watch from a distance. Sometimes they tried to help. More often, they just waited for the collapse to finish its work. But the worst cases were subtle. The shaman who kept smiling, kept healing, kept performing, but whose eyes stayed vacant. The trance came to easily. The songs sounded hungry. These were the ones who never slept alone, even when no one shared the hut. The ones who whispered apologies to the air, to the corners of the ceiling, to something that answered back only in dreams. Still, people came to them, because power is irresistible, even when it smells like smoke and rotting desire. Some said these shamans had simply gone too far, that they had touched the gods too many times, and the gods had started to touch back, harder, longer, without asking. And yet, the role persisted. The madness was accepted as a risk, like snakebite or drowning. The erotic power of the shaman couldn't be removed without emptying the whole vessel. And no one wanted an empty shaman, because even when they teetered on the edge, even when they loved things no one else could see, they still knew the rituals. They still sang the songs. And in the end, they were still the only ones brave or broken enough to kiss the gods on the mouth.